What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Founder Hour podcast. I'm your co-host, Posh.
I'm Pat.
And this is our first virtual podcast interview. We've been doing this for 2.5 years, and we always do it in person, even when it's just me and Pat. So we're excited that Melanie and Darien, the co-founders of Brella, are our first virtual podcast guests, and hopefully we'll meet in the future soon when things go back to normal. But thank you guys so much for being accommodating and being on the show with us. So it's great to talk to you guys.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Thank you. So why don't we just kick it off with, and maybe we'll go one by one. Feel free to choose who wants to go first. Tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and what you guys did before starting Brella.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. So this is Darien. So my background is actually in architecture. I worked as an architect in New York and in LA for the last 12 years prior to starting Brella. And, a big part of actually my motivation in starting this company had to do with my experience at my last job, which was working at a large corporate firm called Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in New York. So until that point, I had worked in more boutique firms. I had worked for Rem Koolhaas, who is a well-known Dutch architect. I had done my own projects, and I found myself a few years ago at SOM in New York working on large mixed-use developments like Hudson Yards and Manhattan West. And these projects are really like cities within a city. And so there was a lot of conversation about, the future of retail, the future of real estate development in general, what types of uses are relevant to the built environment in real life versus what types of transactions and experiences can happen online. At the same time, I had my first son, who was at that point a toddler and was pregnant with my second child, and really struggled on a day-to-day basis with childcare. And I thought, it was super interesting that, on one hand, every other industry was sort of being considered or reinvented in terms of the future of X. It was becoming more streamlined, more integrated with every other facet of life, but childcare hadn't been updated in so long. And so, I started thinking about this from my own experience, but within the context of looking at a lot of those macro trends that were informing my work, and really wanted to think about, what would childcare look like if it were actually designed for the needs of today's parents and parents in the coming generations. Right. And so at that point, I had actually been connected to Melanie through a mutual friend. We were set up on a blind date, and she can explain her background. But for me, it had to do with that personal experience, seeing that need kind of at a larger scale, and lastly, kind of how that could actually inform the built environment and the future of cities. Like, could there be a model of childcare that could be an anchor amenity as opposed to a use that gets marginalized in a church basement or in a rec center in a suburban, neighborhood. So at that point we were set up, and this was about 3 years ago.
And Darien, before we get into how you two met and, how Brella and everything else came to be, how did you enjoy being in the architecture space? I mean, like, I went to Hudson Yards last year. It was obviously just a magnificent site. And obviously, you say a city within a city. It literally was. But how was it like working on such large scale projects like that and living in a city like New York and raising a toddler, there?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was really hard. I came into that project specifically kind of later on, and I was a technical architect. So I was dealing, at that point, it was well under construction. And so it was about construction administration and starting to see some of that tenanting action, which is where a lot of these conversations were coming from. But personally, I found that there were a lot of benefits to being in New York with a young child in terms of cultural access, a sense of community. but there was no purposeful placemaking for families. There were so few places that
Mm.
were actually felt comfortable and accommodating and engaging for children and adults at the same time. They're either fully kid spaces or adult spaces. And there was this lack of, I think really intentional, really exciting placemaking for families with young kids that would make cities like New York or like many other cities more livable for families with young kids.
Yeah, I met Darien at a really critical moment in my life. I had just moved out to Los Angeles from New York as well. Um, I had my first child, was about to have my second or getting close to having my second. And I had already had him. And I was sort of in career limbo. I had not found it easy to find a new career in a totally new city. And a lot of that had to do with the lack of support. So my background's actually in marketing. I started my career in advertising, working for brands like Schick and Energizer and Johnson and Johnson. I went to business school and then ended up at Bravo, where I did a lot of marketing and digital media work, and then ultimately landed at an Amazon subsidiary called Quidsi, where I worked with brands like soap.com and diapers.com on their marketing initiatives. So at the time when I came to LA, I was sort of unmoored and I was struggling to figure out how to start a new career. And the biggest challenge that I was facing was childcare and not really feeling comfortable justifying the expense of getting a nanny so that I could either start my own business or, do the interviewing or kind of actively get back into work. And I think when Darien reached me, I was at such a moment of crisis. And when she kind of posed this idea of rebuilding childcare and really starting from the ground up, I got so excited because childcare was such a limiting factor in my life. And it really felt like something that needed to be built from start or from scratch. And that seemed like a really cool puzzle. It seemed like a really exciting marketing challenge. It seemed like a really cool opportunity to create a new experience. And these were all things that I love to do. So I think it was just a really serendipitous opportunity.
You talk about, rebuilding childcare. Can you talk to us a little bit about, what that looked like from your lens? I mean, Pat and I don't know, but what was that environment like? I mean, what was or what were the options uh, beyond having a nanny that were available to parents?
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple. So, the childcare systems that we have all sort of started around the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they've existed since then. So, at the simplest form, there are babysitters and nannies that are independent contractors that you find that you create a contract with, and that you bring into your home and they care for your children. And then at the next sort of level, there are center-based care. So there are daycares, preschools. These are all licensed child care centers. They go through a licensing process with the state. Sometimes they're located in homes. Sometimes they're located in more commercial buildings. Um, and those are historically, more educationally focused. But what we found was really frustrating about all of these models was that they tended to require some sort of long-term commitment, whether that's a contract that you have, a year-long tuition you're paying at a school, or even a commitment to a nanny that you're going to have her on the books for the next, month or so. Um, they also were pretty limited in their scheduling capacity. So with a school, you are locked into the school schedule. So that might be Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. It might be Monday through Friday, 9 to 1. But you're locked into that. Right. And then the last thing is that if you don't use it, so maybe you take a vacation, maybe your kid is sick for a week, you still have to pay. And that's one of the most challenging things for families. Childcare is the second biggest expense for families after their housing. And every bit
Wow.
counts. And so if you don't use it, to have to still pay for it feels like something, that is so archaic and punitive at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like it's so restrictive, like all of those facets that Melanie described. And meanwhile, life has become more and more dynamic, more on demand, more on the go. Every other service and consumer industry has become more about access than ownership. I mean, everything's gone in that trajectory, and yet childcare has not. And so it's become a real friction point when we've looked at, how work behaviors, office policies have evolved to allow parents, for instance, more flexibility, which is a great thing. But if your childcare is not flexible too, then it's pointless, right? So what we really wanted to do was break open that framework, which seemed really dated compared to how people are living, and allow families to access great care essentially on their own terms. So on their own schedule, they can book and pay by the hour. They can do everything through an app as opposed to these paper applications and paper check payments, which still is really the status quo for most centers. And that it would be physically convenient within cities and communities. And so bringing it back to that built environment and that kind of space proposition, that it's not, a remote location you're driving to, that we are at the heart of mixed use neighborhoods where families are already spending their time.
So here you two are, like, you first meet for the first time, and then what do you talk about in that first meeting about Brella? Like, was it even called Brella? What was the idea, the vision? How were you going to get this started? Did you need funding? Like, tell us a little bit about that initial sort of phase.
Yeah, we had to get to know each other a little bit. I think actually our first meeting, I was still living in New York and was in the process of moving my family back to LA. We had lived in LA prior to moving to New York.
I came into it with a lot of skepticism. So a friend of ours, so somebody I had worked with at Quidsy, introduced us. And it was in a really weird way. She just randomly emailed me one day. She said, I want to introduce you to Darien. She's starting this business, and you should be her co-founder. And it felt out of the blue. And I was coming into this with a lot of skepticism or anxiety around like what a co-founder relationship could be like. I had seen a disastrous co-founder relationship that ended really negatively with some good friends of my husband and mine, and kind of went into this thinking, oh my gosh, I need to like kick the tires on every aspect. So I feel like I put Darien through a crazy set of ringers like really early on. I wanted to like insert conflict as quickly as possible to see how we would manage it and what would happen. And I think that was okay, although it really set us on a path of being super professional and focused and problem solving. And it took us a long time to break through that and like become friendly and friends with each other.
So, you always hear, when co-founders come together, they always say it's good to have, spread out the roles and the responsibilities, so that way that you're not clashing and you're working efficiently. Did you guys have that conversation? Did you have like certain specific responsibilities that you each were going to do, or was it just like, let's just start working, let's put it out there, and then we'll figure it out once that time comes?
We had that conversation. We were very official about our roles.
We made a really hilarious matrix, like in our third meeting, probably, of who was going to decide, like be the decision maker in different categories, and then who the tiebreaker would be. And at that point, it was very early others in that stage, which was hilarious. It's interesting because, we have different backgrounds and skill sets, but there are quite a few areas that do overlap. I think when it comes to the brand, that's something that I think we both feel really strongly about in terms of the messaging and the design, and that, we work really closely together on. And there are other things that obviously we're, just in our own lanes, kind of heads down managing. But it's also a work in process. Like, it was very different pre-launch, what that division was. And then once we opened our doors, that's had to adjust, and it continues to do so. So, I mean, I think the main takeaway would be kind of continuing to check in around that matrix and reevaluate it, monthly, honestly.
I'm curious. A lot of the people that we sit down with and talk to, they're all founders, but for the most part, a lot of them wanted to be entrepreneurs from like day one. They went into it and, left college or dropped out of high school, whatever their story was, their path was entrepreneurship. From what I've learned so far, I mean, it doesn't seem like that was the first priority for either of you. Maybe more for Melanie because she went to business school. But did you both ever think that entrepreneurship was something that you would eventually pursue?
Definitely not. And it's funny, I was surrounded by entrepreneurs and I always felt like that was not something I wanted to do and that I didn't have the personality for it. I think I, know that I'm somebody who thrives on a lot of praise and success. And I know that, well, now I know officially that entrepreneurship is rooted in failures and rejections. And, I really kind of thought that I would never succeed in an environment like that. And so I never had any interest in it. I liked the idea of creating experiences. And so I enjoyed working in startup like environments, but I never wanted to be the person that had to drive that. So it's been a big change for me for sure. I've seen it. I've seen the inside of these companies. I've seen what it's like to start a company. And it honestly didn't have a lot of allure for me, ironically.
Yeah, I mean, it was not my world at all. And I think that's part of why, one of the things that was really interesting in initially connecting with Melanie was kind of having, her insights given that perspective. But, I had worked for a lot of different types of clients, at different firms. I had worked obviously for entrepreneurs, for different companies, for institutions, for government agencies. And, it wasn't something that was really on my radar at the beginning, but I found that sort of by the time I was, at that transition of thinking about starting a business, I realized that was really what I was doing was, what I was good at in architecture was taking, a brief, maybe a context, parameters, different constraints, and synthesizing that into, another version. In most cases, at that point, it was a physical version of a vision or a number of factors, but it was about synthesis and then kind of manifesting that, bringing that to life in the world in a different form. And so I was doing that, and that's really where my strength was. I was always, in the very heavy on the early stages of projects, kind of taking all the information and then kind of setting the course of the design vision for that, and then how that would play out, across scales or even organizing our team internally. And so it was interesting because I was trying to figure out, well, do I keep doing this in architecture? Do I really need to just be working on buildings, or is it more of a conceptual, practice, and what other forms can that take?
Right.
So, kind of going back, like after you've had this vision, and you meet and you're both on the same page, what was the first order of business? Like, did you have to get the physical space? Did you have to get the word out? Like, how did you go about getting the ball rolling?
No, actually the first thing we actually did was build a model, which feels really against everything that we do, right? I mean, neither of us are financial.
Right.
And I think that was a really interesting place to start for us. But, we really wanted to make sure that this business would work. And, we had spoken to a lot of people and, people who had been in childcare, who had potentially even tried to do what we were doing. And their first comments to us were, this will never work. It will never be profitable. And so I think that was the first test we needed it to pass. And so we brought on a financial analyst who, I think we paid him like $500, which felt like $1 billion at the time because it was our own money. And we sat down with him and we built this ridiculous model. But a lot of that is actually what we use today. And a lot of it has actually come to be true and accurate, which is cool. But it was not fun, and it was pushed us out of our comfort zone. But it was, I think, the rigor we needed to feel confident to move forward.
What was your solution to childcare before launching this, and what was the main problem that I guess, were going out to solve, and what did it look like on day one?
I mean, I would say between Melanie and I, we have used every possible childcare solution out there. In the days of actually working on Brella, at that point, I had quit my job. And when we met, I was 8 months pregnant with my second kid. So that first year of working together, I was, had a baby on my lap most of the time. Melanie then got pregnant with her third child. So we were surrounded by children in building this business. And it was very meta because, especially in the early days of fundraising and taking all different kinds of meetings, our schedules were wildly unpredictable and erratic from week to week. And finding any type of childcare solution that would meet those needs was incredibly challenging. So for me, I had a combination of my mom, who would come into town for weeks at a time, a network of babysitters, my husband. But it was chaos. And I think that also really fueled the fire of wanting to solve this problem, because life is dynamic. More families than not have those types of needs. And there should be a version of really great care that you can access when you need it.
Yeah, there were a lot of investor calls we were on where we were muted for most of the time because we had children on our laps, or we were literally breastfeeding. It was super awkward, and they would be telling us, "Oh, parents don't need childcare," and you're sitting there with a child on your lap, like begging and hoping that they'll be quiet when you have to answer a question. And the reality is just presented in such a visceral way, and it's so motivating and also so inspirational. I mean, so much of this business is built off of our own personal need for childcare that could literally be on demand.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that, those initial investor calls. When did you? I guess so. You go through the financial model. It looks good. You want to pursue this. Now I'm assuming, presumably, you have to raise money to start the venture. How we hear about Silicon Valley and we hear about venture capital and that whole world, and it's predominantly males. I can understand why it might have been difficult in those early days. So tell us about those discussions and how it ultimately turned out.
Yeah, it was a roller coaster.
It ultimately turned out well.
Yeah.
We were able to raise $3 million, but it was not by any means a beautiful process. And I would say, what's really interesting is how long it was. And, when we were in it, we would never admit it, but it was probably close to a year and a half of actual, from our first ever investor call to, when we actually closed the round. And there was a huge learning curve. And, I think we didn't have any really kind of negative experiences that you often hear a lot of females going through. And I think, we could talk a lot about some of the support that we actually got from a lot of male investors. And, so I think that was really positive. What I think was really frustrating for us was just, how naive we were at the beginning of the process and how much we would have benefited from people being really honest and helping us, fix our deck and make sure our story was tight. And, it took us a very long time to get the story to a place where, we really understood and could answer questions confidently and really, I think, instill the confidence in an investor. So a lot of it was maybe necessary for us to go through.
It was really good. And it also, built our network of, advisors and strategic relationships that are critical to the business now. So there were a lot of silver linings. I mean, we were lucky to have some early supporters, some early angel investors, mostly from the real estate world, that I think saw the potential in a new version of childcare. We had a lot of big disappointments kind of in the middle of the process, where especially in pitching to VCs, where we thought, we would be able to raise more capital from, a single investor than we thought. And at a certain point, we realized, you know what, we're going to have to cobble together millions of dollars through $25,000 to $50,000 checks. We're just going to have to scrape our way there. And I think once we kind of accepted that, then it started flowing, and there wasn't so much friction. We, like Melanie said, we got the story right. We understood the rhythm. Yeah, it was a process.
So, and then what do you do next? Like, so, I'm assuming you get a space, and then you start marketing and getting the word out there. Was that kind of like the next step?
We actually identified the space pretty early, and we really needed the space in order to raise for this use. We needed to show that we had a lease. We needed to show investors what the terms were and how that worked with our model. So, it was important. I think the doors started to be unlocked when we had the space and we had our branding. And then, people could really get it.
But to your question about sort of how did we open this, what's super frustrating or a challenge in childcare is that if you want to be licensed, you cannot market your business until you get your license. And, the way the license works is that you get the license when you've completely built it out, when every toy is in every room. So basically, when you're ready to open, you get your license. So we didn't really have the ability to do a lot of pre-marketing and pre-sales. We probably did a little bit, even though we weren't supposed to. But most of that was really on the ground. We just basically moved into this, shopping center that we are in right now, the Runway, and we had events. We went to the farmers market and set up booths at the farmers market and stood there in the beating sun day in and day out, and just told people about us. But it was very guerrilla. There was not really a lot that we could do until we were actually licensed and open in terms of driving people to our business.
What is Brella, and how is it different than other childcare options that are out there? I mean, whether there are parents listening or future parents or whoever it may be, what and how does Brella work?
Yeah, so it kind of starts with our app, which we haven't talked about at all. So usually, like with conventional centers, you find out about a daycare in your community, you inquire. Typically, there's a 6-month to year-long waiting list. You sign up. A lot of people sign up while they're still pregnant or expecting, and you hope that you get a spot. And then once you get a spot, you're locked in because you're going to go to the back of that list. And we wanted to cut through all of that. So a big part of that was building our app, which allows families to literally, once they input, critical information about their child, their age, etc., go in and immediately just schedule hours of care directly without any of those steps. And that was really huge. One, to kind of simplify access, simplify the booking process, make it customizable, let people pay through their app, just kind of cut through all of those barriers. And then, I think the licensing thing, which we should talk about a little bit more, the reason it's so important is that if a center is not licensed, parents legally cannot leave the premises. And so in order for it to be a robust solution, you have to be licensed. And so combining that kind of flexibility and access with a licensed center where you could drop off your child for 10 hours, that doesn't exist anywhere.
I think there's a couple other really big differences too. I think the design of the center is really contemporary. And, one thing that childcare has lacked for a really long time is any sense of brand or hospitality. And, where Darien and I really got excited about this was that we could kind of bring childcare bring a new experience into childcare. So our center, the look, the feel of it, it's not a place where parents want to run out the door and get out as fast as they can. And usually, actually,
Right.
families and parents want to stay as long as they can because the color palette is really beautiful and the furniture is beautiful. And, there's actually real benefits to that too for cognitive development for the children. But, we wanted to just create spaces for families that weren't red, yellow, and blue and had wipe away surfaces and just felt like you wanted to get out of there as fast as you could. And I think that's really been received so positively by the families who've been using us. Like they'll literally ask us where the furniture's from so they can buy it for their homes. And I think that that's like the ultimate flattery when they really want to bring Brella back to their own spaces.
So tell us a little bit how like the last couple of years have been in terms of just growing the company and the brand, and also how you see it ultimately panning out for the next like 5 to 10 years of like your expansion and what that's going to look like. Because I know we kind of talked about it, but there are like a lot of adjacent, obviously, businesses to childcare, like just like office buildings and offices, and like I know my gym has an area, but that's more so just like for kids to play. But like tell us a little bit about how you envision that.
It's a little weird to answer that question today, right? While we've been working on this business for 3 years, we were only open for 5 months before we had to close our doors because of COVID. And so we're in this little suspended moment. The bummer, the good news, but then the bummer at the same time was that, the month that we were closing our doors was our first month of being break even. And the business had really started to grow and was really successful. And only in, 4 months was it able to do that. And that was such a huge victory. And we were literally about to kick off and fundraise to go and open more of these because we had a proof of concept. And then Corona came, and we're actually in Brella right now, and it's empty of children, and we don't know when children will be back. And so it's definitely changed our plans.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think the reality is like with so many other industries, the change and the adaptation that Corona has forced, a lot of it was in the works or it was waiting to happen. And I think what's going on right now with families is that, this experience of isolation is calling into question a lot of, the social norms of behavior, how parents divide household responsibilities, who works on what schedule, and how they take care for their kids and how they parent. And so I actually think that out of this experience, there's going to be more diversity in kind of family lifestyles, in family schedules, and in preferences, ranging from people that are very hesitant going back into center-based care and wanting to take it 1 hour at a time, to people that are ready today and, have the confidence, especially in Brella, the users that were coming here and, know our high standards around hygiene. And so I think in some ways, our product is very well suited for life after COVID, in that families can really make it customized to their needs, and that we can be a support system, not just for one type of family, but for a range of different types of families, which ultimately is our mission. We strive to be a form of childcare in which families thrive, and that we can be a support system that adapts with families as they change over time. So we're actually excited in some ways because I think this story, has a lot of relevance right now, and we really want to help families come out of this and, with all of the different life changes that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and you bring up just kind of the situation after COVID, and I think one of the things that both Pat and I, and I'm sure several others have been thinking about is that the world is going to look like a different place after this is all said and done. However, it's almost as if things that were going to happen 3-4 years from now it's going to be accelerated. Like it's going to happen in the next 3-4 months versus the next 3 to 4 years, right? And when Darien, you emailed us and you said parents and children, they're like not okay right now. I've seen that. I serve on a school board, and I see a lot of the preschool parents struggling to both teach their kids and work and cook and be moms and dads. And I mean, most of them are not suited to teach and raise their kids in for those 8 hours, right? They usually are with them for the evening. They put them to sleep, they feed them breakfast, whatnot. But early on, I remember when I was, a young kid and my grandma used to raise me, my mom raised me, it was like a full-time job. So I feel like, if anything, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's going to be a bigger need for childcare because of the fact that people are going to realize how important it is and how much they can't actually do it themselves. I mean, have you heard that from parents? I'm curious about, you know, the experiences that you two have had during the last month or so with this.
We hear it every day. I mean, our parents are literally begging us to open up. And I think the reality is what you're saying is, you know, teaching is a profession. And, you know, all of a sudden
Absolutely.
everybody's being expected to do something, you know, it's like being expected to perform surgery. You know, people go to school and learn
Right.
how to teach. All of our teachers here are licensed, and Darien and I are constantly asking them, okay, well, what advice can we give to our parents? What language do you use? How do you discipline a child in a school? Because it's all really different. And I do think that these experiences that every family is having at home, where this is not working, you know, for the majority of families, homeschooling is not working. I think that will just, you know, solidify the place for, you know, childcare and schools in society. You know, I don't think people are going to say, "Oh, wow, that was great. We don't need schools anymore." I think it's quite the opposite. So, what they're going to want is, you know, something that's more flexible. You know, and a lot of parents are having to pay tuition right now for schools that they're not using. And I think that there is going to be a lot more demand for something that is more responsive and flexible to all the changes that are happening.
And I think it's also revealed, especially for kids, you know, 0 to 6, which is our focus at Brella, that there's no virtual product that is going to replace, obviously, the care from a teacher or a caregiver. I mean, obviously, babies, right? But there are a lot of virtual and online offerings for preschool age kids. And the reality is, their primary source of learning is through social interaction. And nothing is going to create that same nuance of connection online. And we've realized in our own homes just how challenging it is. You know, with a 3-year-old on a Zoom class, after 5 minutes, they're just like, whatever. I mean, it's not giving them what they need. They need to be interacting with other people and with materials in physical space in order to build those links between their motor development, their cognitive development, their social and emotional skills. So I think that the general awareness of that is heightened at this moment.
What are the benefits, you know, from that age 0 to 6? And I think there's a lot of benefits, but of really having that development, right? That cognitive development and the socialization. What are the long term effects of that? And if we see kids not going back to school for 3 or 6 months or beyond that, what type of effect will that have for their long-term, you know, social interactions, their long-term ability to communicate or to even learn? Or is there any sort of study happening right now, or any sort of research that's happening, or anything that you guys know that you can share with us and our audience?
Sure. I mean, you know, it's tough. We I don't think that there's ever been any study on, you know, depriving children of any type of social interaction for months at a time, other than really like
Yeah, crazy.
terrifying ones in orphanages and things like that. But you know, I think we could talk first about the benefits.
Mhm.
You know, there are a lot of concrete benefits to center-based care, and that's really why we wanted to go this route. Most of them are in the social and emotional skill set that children develop. So that's everything from learning how to share, learning how to take turns, learning how to be patient. But those all sort of directly lead to executive functions that are, you know, things that ultimately later in life allow you to be a leader, to work in an organization, to, you know, engage with people, to problem solve. Exactly. And so, you know, what researchers have seen, and there's a lot of evidence that children who start schooling early often develop their language skills faster. They, you know, end up performing better in both high school and in college. They have a higher likelihood of graduating from college. They also have a higher likelihood of succeeding in their professions. So it does, ironically, the decisions that a lot of parents make early on in life do have implications that are long lasting for their children. The situation we're in now is really strange because, all children are going through this. And, this isn't a very natural way for children to learn. I mean, they're social beings. They want to be out. They learn through being with other children, and, other children model for them. And so I think, any child development specialist would say this is not ideal for children. But at the same time, there's not really a choice. And I think we all have to be kind and understanding that in this moment, nobody's, intentionally trying to harm our children. So it's tough. I mean, the hope, and I think that there is a lot of pressure on schools to open up again because of the understanding that for so many kids, and especially children in lower income neighborhoods where they don't have the resources, school is so critical, especially in those early years, not just to give them food, but really to give them the foundation that they need to be a high functioning adult.
And kind of to follow up on that, we see studies happening all the time about like, things like whether it might be mental health for an example or whatever, and like when that sort of develops and what causes, certain functions, not to work as well and that kind of stuff. Like, how does that all play into the way you approach, your, I don't know if it's called not a curriculum, but like what you choose to focus on or teach the kids from a young age, and what is your personal approach to that, and how do you stay on top of all that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much research out there about, the kind of sequencing and the timeline of brain architecture, and how much of that foundation is set just from the ages of 0 to 3, and then from 3 to 7. And then at that point, kind of the primary circuitry is there. And so this is really the main opportunity. And I think that's a huge dimension of our passion around Brella, is that, early childhood education is one of our biggest design opportunities when we think about investing in the future of society, right? Like, this is that foundational moment that is shaping generations to come. And, for us, it has a lot to do with obviously addressing like all of a child's needs, all of the different types of physical, social, emotional, cognitive development that are happening. And that varies, in the first 2 years of life, that is varying radically from month to month. And so, how we approach it, we do have a curriculum. We draw from, a lot of very well respected philosophies from Montessori to Reggio. We are not strictly, any one type of school. We're not a Waldorf school, for instance. But I think we draw a lot of the foundational ideas around things like the impact of environment on a child's experience. And so obviously the design of our space, language, how we teach language, how we model language, how teachers speak to each other, and the impact that has on children. Our space itself is interesting because if you kind of look at the plan of the space, that thematically tells the story of our curriculum. Instead of children spending their whole day in a single classroom, we have different types of learning environments. So we're sitting right now in the creative playroom. We have an art lab for not only art, but STEM experiences and sensory play. We have a library, we have an infant nursery, we have a movement studio, we have a garden. And so thematically, those describe, the types of activities that really are the context for a variety of learning. It's really important within each room that, for instance, as an example, there are spaces for group play, group interaction, group projects, and also always spaces for individual work, because it's that kind of ebb and flow between the two that are really important for developing confidence and resilience and emotional regulation. So there's, it's incredibly thoughtful and intentional. But we like to think that, in a way, we are building a new philosophy that makes those principles relevant to the reality of contemporary life, which is this dynamic, this on the go, this variable experience, which brings, new set of factors into the experience.
Have you guys been communicating at all with any of the children that, used to come, to the facilities before? And have you guys been discussing how you are going to then now get them back once, hopefully things normalize sooner rather than later? I mean, there's this period of time now where they haven't really interacted with people outside of their own family members. Does that, or will that affect them in any way? And is that going to have to alter the way you develop your schedule and curriculum moving forward?
Yeah, I think the primary challenge we're going to face is a new wave of separation anxiety. And, we have a wonderful parent educator who we've been working really closely on this, but separation is always a challenge. It's especially a challenge at Brella when you have children that are coming almost every day that are separating potentially for the first time. And so that was always a challenge. We've worked really hard and we've trained our teachers. But I think what we're going to see is after months of being with their families, with their parents, even children who were excellent at separating are going to have a really hard transition, saying goodbye and leaving this new routine that they're in. I mean, children love consistency. They love, having access to their parents. And so like they're in a lot of ways thriving. And so to kind of go back to normal routines, even when they're going back to the schools and their friends they knew, I think there's going to be a lot of challenge for parents. And so, we will work with our families. We will probably create a lot of literature for parents. We'll do a lot of sessions to just kind of help them navigate through that, because that's always so emotionally hard for a parent. When you have a child who's hysterical crying and you need to leave because you need to go to work, especially when that kid might be older or past what you thought was a time where they would have separation anxiety. So I think that that's going to be a really big issue. Ironically, people are seeing that now, like even parents when they go take a shower, kids who wouldn't normally cry are starting to cry. So it's going to be a big challenge for all families.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, we hear like how different industries are being disrupted. Like, for example, education. A lot of disruptions are focused on the personalization of education rather than this like one size fits all model where everyone presumably learns the same way and retains information the same way. How do you see that applying to kids that are like 0 to 3 years old? I know traditionally and probably even now it's been like a one size fits all sort of thing where it's like everyone's learning the same thing because you're a baby and that's pretty much it. Do you see it becoming, I can, like, the reason I ask is like I can imagine with things like gene editing and CRISPR and you have these like super babies at some point compared to like how babies are now. Like, do you see like it becoming more personalized moving forward, and how?
Yeah, our philosophy has always been that it's very personalized, but personalization for a 0 to 3 year old, that's not necessarily done through an algorithm, right? I mean, it's basically just allowing them to learn the way they want to learn. So, what's interesting about a classroom at Brella is that, the kids are not all doing the same thing. So children don't walk into a classroom and there's not a worksheet and they're all not going to color the same worksheet. They are going to walk into a room where there are a variety of materials like toys or, paints or something that are set up in a provocative way. They're literally called provocations. And basically invites children to play with them as they see fit. And our teachers watch and observe and then help the children in the play that the children are essentially leading. And so in that sense, it is hyper personalized. Each child that walks into the room gets to create their own experience. Obviously, it's curated and the materials are intentionally placed and then all of it is done in a way to potentially, help children with their fine motor skills or help them, understand color theory. So there's a lot of intention behind it. But I think that's really the kind of the beauty of that early education is that it has this possibility to just be naturally personalized and individualized in a way that you don't really have to force it. You don't need a lot of science. You don't need technology to do it. It kind of just comes naturally. All you need to do is foster it.
The range of what's developmentally appropriate for an 18-month-old it's radically wide, right? Like one 18-month-old may be here, another there. You look at all of their different types of development. And so kids know what's developmentally appropriate for them. And the biggest thing is getting out of their way. And, like Melanie said, it's about observation and then response that is meeting them where they are, meeting the child where he or she, where they are. And so that's not something new to Brella either. That's the foundation of Montessori, of Reggio, of Rye. It's really about respect for the child's kind of natural pace of development.
And I don't know if you mentioned it already, but I know we talked about how, technology, like for example, like virtual daycare and algorithms aren't necessarily going to be things that, improve the way, you go about it. But how do you see technology over time, like being integrated with the process and improving the overall, not just experience, but the efficiency and the value of it all?
Technology plays a huge part of Brella. It begins with the scheduling, but that's probably sort of the simplest aspect of it. So, one critical part of the Brella app is the profile that parents create for their children. And so you can basically tell us everything from what they're allergic to, what their napping behaviors are, what their personality is like. And that sort of becomes the basis from which our teachers can then, really get to know your child very quickly. So we have children being dropped off for the first time almost every day at Brella. And the app that parents use that then our teachers have access to allows them to really quickly get to know a child in a way that might have taken many conversations or at least, a 20-minute dialogue. And I think that's a really interesting, technological opportunity that you don't really see in schools right now. And then also sort of that feedback then back to the parent about what the child did. So I think that technology can play this amazing supportive role around childcare that doesn't have to be immediately part of taking care of the child. So, everything from, a quick note to the teacher about my son had a really bad night last night. That will help the teacher then know, okay, I, might need to give them a little more patience. And then, a nice sort of feedback loop at the end where the teacher can send a picture to the parent and share, a little bit about what the child had done so that the parent can, ask the child and get maybe even, continue that conversation or exploration at home.
I think at scale too, when you think about, a network of Brellas across the country and a family who is in our system who has profiles for their children in our app, they've done that once. And now their information is available to all of our centers. And so our goal really is to build this out so that if you as a family are across the country and need access to care, you don't have to go through all of those barriers again. It's a huge amount of red tape that's eliminated when that information is managed, in a more efficient way.
We forgot to note in the beginning that Brent Bolthouse, who introduced us to you, essentially, we interviewed him twice on the show. He's become a good friend, and one of our actually people's favorite guests on the show. And so when I first found out about the concept, I automatically was like, "This is awesome!" Like, loved it, checked it out. And one of my favorite components was the fact that there was a space, and correct me if I'm wrong, for parents to also work there and take calls or whatever it may be. How do you see that playing a role as this whole work from home, work remotely culture becomes a lot more prevalent across, the city, state, country, whatever it may be? Do you think that there will be a bigger need for or a bigger desire for parents to actually stay and use your space?
I almost feel like it's like a reverse of how it used to be, where the office buildings had their like daycare centers, and then
Right.
you would take the kid and you would go work in the office. Now, like
Yeah,
that
you
model
stay
is
with
like
your
the
kid.
opposite of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things like Melanie and I have talked about in the last few weeks is that the reality is you need different spaces for different functions. for different activities and parts of your day. And so one of the things that's so maddening for families right now is that, your kitchen table has become your office, your partner's office, your kid's classroom, playroom, and the meal eating environment. And it's crazy. And unless you have a robotic kitchen table, like, it's never going to fulfill those needs in a good way. And so, I think even as we see potentially more people working from home or working remotely, it's really challenging to work from home. I mean, there's a lot out there about just the sense of isolation, the impacts of that on productivity. And so just even having a place like Brella where parents can come and get a few hours of heads down work here, maybe break it up if they live locally, can go back home as well, and not put all of that pressure on the home, I think provides a huge relief. On the flip side of that, some parents, especially, first-time parents of a newborn, really like the idea of proximity. And for parents that are easing back into work or in the midst of a career change, maybe they're starting their own business and they want a place where they can, be close to their child, but have that physical separation of space that makes it productive. We're a great solution.
You mentioned something super early on too, that prior to this whole situation coming, you were both looking to fundraise and expand Brella. And I mean, after 4 months of doing it and getting to the break even point, I mean, that just is phenomenal. And props to you guys for doing that. And I'm sure that once everything kind of comes back, that will continue. But don't you think that now more than ever, because of this situation, that an expansion is even more of something that could become a reality and more of a need, as opposed to something that you two thought you wanted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely a huge opportunity coming out of this. And I think that there's on a couple fronts. I mean, from the demand standpoint, I think demand will be huge. And especially for a childcare provider that can address not only the demands around childhood development, but also around safety and cleanliness. And we are hyper vigilant around cleanliness at Brella. We have professional cleaners come through every night. Our staff is cleaning throughout the day. So I think there will be new standards to meet, but I think we're really poised well for that. But I think there's like another really exciting opportunity, and that's just from the real estate standpoint. And as we were going into this fundraise, one of the biggest challenges is finding locations that are cost efficient. We want to be in the center of, where people are working and living and playing, that those rents are high. And I think that there's a really exciting opportunity for us coming out of this. There's going to be a huge shakeup in the real estate world. And if we're poised in a way that we could take advantage of that and secure some really favorable terms, I think we'll really be able to scale this potentially faster than we had ever thought.
On the flip side of being kind of opportunistic about the real estate moment, I think we've always told the story in a genuine way to landlords that this is a priority amenity, and to think of childcare not as a tenant but as an anchor amenity to properties. And I think that the press that has come out about the pain points that families are experiencing during this, I think that'll even be more of a mainstream story that will be a good tailwind for us.
Do you ever think that there may be an opportunity here for franchising Brella for existing owners of childcare places that might, be closing down their businesses but already have some, semblance of a, childcare facility that you can kind of go in and redesign, rebrand, and almost take over, as opposed to, being the ones that are in search of all these different, great terms. Do you think that would ever be a part of the plan?
Yeah, it's something we talk about. It's definitely on our minds. I think, prior to Corona, our stance around franchising was that, it's a possibility for the future. It's so important, especially in childcare, I think, to have quality control and really kind of maintain close ownership of the initial centers. And so it's important, but there's a lot of precedents, when you look at the larger providers that are national players in childcare scaling through acquisition. There's a lot of good precedents of that. And so it's obviously on our minds. It's incredibly helpful in terms of the licensing process to identify sites that are already licensed, and where from a building code perspective, you're not going through a change of use. So
Right.
I think there's also just a cool element to franchising too. We get requests for franchise opportunities all the time, and they're always from moms. And I think that this is a business that a lot of young women really connect to because they've felt the pain of childcare. They like the design, they like the solution. And so, I think that there is a really cool, like built-in, franchisee world of moms who've left their careers to raise their children. So, it's something we think about. It's something that presents itself as an opportunity to us almost organically. But, to successfully franchise, and a lot of our advisors actually are successful franchise owners. So we have a lot of knowledge that comes into this. You really have to get the product down tight. And, we still need to kick the tires on this one in order to get it there.
It's going to be really interesting to see how everything plays out. I think everyone's just sort of on the edge of their seat in every industry, just trying to see how everything comes together after all this. But I'm really excited about the future, and we love what you both are doing, and we wish you all the best and good fortune. And we have no doubt, you'll be able to come back strong and back at it in no time. So
hopefully we can come check out that space soon once we can get out of our home. So we're excited to meet you guys in person as well. And thank you guys so much for hopping on. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to love hearing your story, and we'll have questions and we'll field them to you guys once our listeners check it out. But thank you guys so much, and keep going, and hope to see you guys on the other side.
Yeah, you too. Stay healthy.
Yeah, thank you.